This is Office Hours and our special study of Mary in the New Testament and beyond. It's our first thematic approach to Office Hours, and we're confident that the wheels won't come off completely, but we have some great guests lined up for our conversation. My name is Chris Holmes. I'm the scholar in residence at First Presbyterian Church of Atlanta. I'm joined, as always, by Dr. Brennan, who teaches Old Testament at Columbia Seminary. And this morning, our guest is Dr. Susan Hylen, who is a New Testament professor at Candler School of Theology, and also a good friend to both Brennan and I, and a fellow Emory graduate as well. So, as long as we keep the quantity of Emory graduates in this conversation, I think, maybe the alumni office won't bother us so much for donations. But good morning to you both. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So we, Susan, as we've told you in some emails before, we generally sort of open our office hours with a broad question, which is just inviting our guest hosts to share some of the presuppositions that guide their interpretation of Scripture. And so are there any theological or cultural assumptions that you have about Scripture or interpretation that you would like to share with us? And this obviously doesn't apply just to Mary texts, but to the Bible generally.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I think in general, one would be that I don't think there is a single answer behind the Bible that we're trying to get to as we study it. And that's a very common approach to Scripture, to think that each passage means one thing, right? Or that even that the Bible itself has a single truth behind it that sort of drives everything. But instead, I like to think of the New Testament writings as different parts of a conversation that early Christians were having. That give us a lot of insight into what they believed and how they understood Jesus and what his story meant. And so they're a really rich resource for us as Christians as we engage with them. And I guess the second would be that the Holy Spirit meets us in that process. And so we really can, even if this isn't, a single word that came from God, we are engaging with God as we read Scripture. And that is a spirit-filled process.
Thank you. That's great. Even as a New Testament professor, I'm sure even in some of the technical or harder pieces, we are met with God in the study of Scripture, the reading of Scripture.
I hope so.
Yeah. I feel like I'm always trying to sell my students on that. Like, actually these academic approaches can actually be locations of the Spirit as well.
Right. Well, and I try to also sell them on the fact that, some of the, the really old names, like the people that you've heard of, and had what seemed to us to be some kind of strange ideas now about the Bible, like they were really reading closely. And if you can understand what they were seeing in the passage, then you'll learn something about the Bible, even if you don't end up agreeing with their conclusions.
Yeah, that's great. So, and our second sort of introductory question is, if you wanted to share anything that you're researching or working on these days that, you're excited about, or that you think is particularly interesting that you'd like to share with our viewers or anybody out in the interwebs.
Sure. Well, my research is actually related to our topic today on Mary, because I've been studying the lives of women in the New Testament period and really trying to reassess some of the conclusions that people have drawn in the past about the ways that we think about women, which I would summarize by saying women weren't able to do much. That's kind of what we've thought about women in the ancient world. And we've seen, for a long time, that there's different kinds of evidence for women, including some things where women are doing some really fantastic stuff, right? Even in the New Testament, we have women who show up doing kind of surprising things. But then there's this other language, the restrictive language, that says women shouldn't speak, women should, be submissive to their husbands and stuff like that. And that's true in the culture at large too, that we have that same split. Some some evidence shows women doing remarkable things, and some evidence suggests that they aren't able to do those things.
Right.
And so the question is, how should we understand this complexity, right? So I've been mostly rejecting the other things that people have said in the past. For example, people have said, well, the women who are doing stuff, they're just exceptional, right? A few women sort of escaped the constraints of femininity somehow. We don't know how they did that, but they did, right? And so it's just a little weird. But it turns out that the legal and social norms actually supported the actions of those women and made it possible for women to own property and hold civic offices and things like that. And those were things that I never knew before. So I found that really interesting to learn that that was actually a common part of ancient culture in the New Testament period. But it means that we have to rethink our understanding of, how does the evidence fit together? So I've been trying to offer some new suggestions on how to do that. Mostly thinking of the culture as more complicated than we have understood it to be, right? So our culture is complicated too, right? So it shouldn't be that hard to understand. We have some social norms that support, one idea and other that sometimes conflict, but don't necessarily always conflict, right? So I think in the ancient world, people did widely think that when other things were equal, women were inferior to men. And that was just kind of commonly understood. But at the same time, there were social pathways by which women took on leadership roles and engaged in their communities. And that was a good thing, right? It wasn't the wrong thing to do or a strange thing to do. It just sort of fit somehow alongside these other views that people had.
Yeah. Which I think is, especially as you already mentioned, like a super important way to enter into this conversation of Mary, a female figure in the New Testament, who has her own complexity, as we'll explore in the New Testament in just a few minutes. But also, I think your research really pushes against what I would say are some like commonplace assumptions about women in the New Testament period. Either being, hey, early Christianity was this super egalitarian, totally unique movement within the Roman world, especially in comparison to, Judaism, which was so patriarchal, which is problematic on so many levels. Or, the commonplace assumption is, look at Paul and his letters, and clearly, Christianity is totally misogynistic, just like the whole Roman world was. And so we, have to either get rid of or radically reinterpret all of the New Testament writings. And I feel like what you're doing is really nuanced in between those two assumptions. And I've always, I've greatly appreciated learning from your perspective on, the household codes in Timothy and Titus, and the place of women in early Christianity. So I'm glad that you're doing that work, and people can find you on a number of independent booksellers by searching your name.
Yes,
or the not so independent bookseller as well. We're grateful that you're with us.
Can I just say that's a fantastically interesting and important angle. It makes me think about some of my work in Old Testament, or my field in of the Old Testament. When people think about things in the ancient world that don't seem to make sense when we read the Bible, they often think, well, I'm the problem, right? The contemporary person just doesn't understand the past, but the past made total sense to the people who lived in the past. But instead, like thinking that all of human culture is full of contradictions. All of human culture is full of these tensions. And, instead of thinking like, I just don't understand the past, instead thinking the past was complicated to the people who lived in the past and they didn't understand all of it, right? Even Paul himself seeming conflicted about women and the role of women within the church. And then of course the Pauline tradition, right? What comes out of Paul, being full of tensions in terms of gender. But that might just be, that's true of the ancient world. My colleague here at Columbia Seminary, Christine Yoder, has done some work that is somewhat similar, but in 1,000 years in the past, but thinking about in the Babylonian period, thinking about what were the lives of ancient Israelite women actually like, and finding that it's full of these same tensions that exist. I mean, yeah, this is probably a perennial thing, and today too, right? That there are these tensions between what women are expected to be, what they can be, what they legally can be, and so on. But yeah, that's so important. But also then we can think about Mary in those terms too, that Mary is kind of caught in all of these same tensions in our modern way of thinking about Mary, but also in the past, thinking about a first century Galilean Jewish woman. So in any event, yeah, but thanks so much. That is brilliant. So Chris, how should we, this is a huge topic, and I'm going to kind of, I'm going to sit out a bit today because, speaking of first century Galilean Jewish women, this is not my area of specialty. But Chris, how should we kind of jump into this? How do we get into this topic of Mary in the New Testament?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's like, how are we going to eat this whale in the next 50 minutes? We're gonna eat it bite by bite, and hopefully we'll have some satisfaction from doing so. So I think, Susan, the place that I'm interested in starting for this morning is sort of just naming that for the place that Mary holds in Christianity and even in Islam and other with a variety of Christian traditions, in later developed traditions, it's actually surprising to find out that the New Testament says so little about Mary. There's a few places where she appears prominently, but on the whole, it's almost like an absence or a lack. And so I don't think there's a right answer or a wrong answer, but I wonder what you think about this lack or this apparent lack or absence of references to Mary. What are we to make of this?
That's a great question, Chris. And of course, nobody really knows on the one hand, but I do think, just as you were saying, I was thinking it's sort of like a lot of the other figures that people have become interested in as they read the Bible, right? There's so little there about Mary, but people were naturally curious about her. Later Christians were like, how did this story happen? Why Mary, right? Why does she get chosen to do all this? And what was her life really like? And all of those kinds of questions, right, that arise. And so her story develops over time. And as people think about it and contemplate what they understood her to be and what she meant to the tradition, right? And there are plenty of figures in the New Testament period, right? There's all kinds of the apocryphal writings where people are imagining Enoch and Abraham and Adam and these Old Testament figures whom, some of whom, like Enoch, we know very little about, right? But it gives you an opportunity in a way to express something about what you understand the faith to mean. And Mary has certainly taken on that role in Christian circles.
Yeah, I think with this, Mary is a great example of how New Testament and early Christian writers are filling gaps in the text. I learned that idea as a grad student at Emory. I don't remember. I can't attribute it to whom I learned it, but learning to ask the questions: how are these texts, these later texts, filling in holes that are left by the earlier texts? And I think we can table the question of, where they got this information. Is it complete creative ingenuity on the part of the author? Is it a part of oral tradition or another written, all of those sort of technical questions I think we can table and just say, isn't it interesting that they are filling this gap? That as we'll talk about next week with Brittany Wilson, the Proto-Evangelium of James sort of says, we need to know about Mary's own childhood. She, Jesus is so significant that what was it like for Mary to be a child? And so there is this process of filling gaps in this text. And I think as we consider Mary and the portrait of her in the four Gospels, we might see some of that.
Yeah, and one thing that interest to me is that in the Old Testament, we've got lots of major figures whose parentage is sometimes not explored very thoroughly. I mean, David is one example. I mean, who's David's mom? Jesse, David's dad, is not really explored very much as a character. I mean, he's kind of a name that shows up from time to time. Moses' mother, who receives a bit of attention and then kind of disappears from the story. So that is to say that sometimes these parental figures show up and don't show up in Jewish history and in Jewish theology, but also to say that telling stories about people who are part of the tradition seems to be kind of a Jewish way of doing theology, right? Of thinking through and trying to express like what one believes about God and our neighbor and so on. So that is to say, this is like the stories of Enoch, Susan, you pointed out this is a kind of tried and true way of thinking theologically, thinking about God, and trying to express those thoughts kind of through narrative in a way. So I mean, yeah, for me to see that, you know, Mary doesn't show up in Mark, but Mary shows up in a prominent way in Luke and Matthew in slightly different ways, that might help me grasp some of the ways that Mary shows up differently in the New Testament.
Yeah, I think that's right. So probably the next step in the conversation about Mary in the New Testament is to go where we see her prominently discussed, and just not to get too, you know, dorky, but we can say that the scholarly consensus is that the Gospel of Mark is our earliest written gospel, and that Matthew and Luke are later Gospels that more likely than not used the Gospel of Mark in their composition of a new story about Jesus. Of course, all of this is contested, and people can read it in introductions to the New Testament and elsewhere. But that's the sort of scholarly assumption. And both Mark and John do not contain these birth narratives, but we find them in Matthew and in Luke. And so I think, Susan, maybe you could help us think about these two birth narratives that we see in Matthew and in Luke, and you know, what should we make of these different birth narratives?
Well, partly just to notice how different they really are, right? I think it's hard for Christian readers to even notice sometimes how different the stories are, because we're used to telling one smooth, seamless story where all of these elements appear in the story, right? So if you drive past a church, if your church has a nativity scene outside, you've got Mary and Joseph, you got some shepherds and their sheep there, and then you got the wise man coming from the other side, right? But in the Bible, like, nobody tells the story that way, right? Matthew tells us a story about Joseph and the wise men, and Luke tells us a story from Mary's angle and about the shepherds, and they're really different stories, right? In Matthew, the couple seems to live in Bethlehem at the beginning of the story, and in Luke, they travel from the Galilee to Bethlehem in order for Jesus to be born. And so again, I don't think we should ask why necessarily, because we'll never really get an answer to that question, why they're different. But the fact that they are different gives us a sense that these authors had something a little bit different to say about who Jesus was, and to tell the story of his birth in a way that was certainly significant, but sometimes, you know, just sheds light on Jesus in a different way.
Yeah. So, and Brennan asks these questions, and he knows that I'm terrible at geography, so I have very little to add. But even just the locations that you mentioned, Nazareth of Galilee or the Galilee versus Bethlehem, and is there any significance to those locations as we think about the perspectives of Matthew or Luke? Or do you have I don't have a good, nuanced, informed answer, so I'm happy to defer to you on this question.
Maybe one way to frame it too is just to say that in all of the stories about Jesus's life, I mean, in all the four canonical Gospels, there is some tension between Jesus's identity as both a Judahite or a Jew, and as someone, a resident or kind of a native of Galilee. Yeah. And maybe what is the difference between those two regions? And, you know, what does that mean that Jesus has kind of both of these? And then Mary, of course, has both of these kind of as a part of her identity somehow.
It's a good question, and it's kind of hard to parse out. I mean, I think we know really little about the family, where they came from, really, and where, like, what their social status was like within that, which would be really interesting to know more about. It's even hard to tell from the Gospels, like they just give us very few markers. But the Galilee's more of the backwater, right? So if they're really from Bethlehem, it's maybe more likely that there were, you know, I don't know, more of a prominent family, right? More in the more connected in some way, right, to important people or something like that. That's less likely to happen in Nazareth, which is at the time a really small little town. Kind of, it's not in the middle of nowhere, but it's 5 miles to the big city or something like that.
The Galilee, I mean, I'm way out of my wheelhouse here, so I might be totally wrong. But Galilee, was before the time of the Maccabees, before the time of the Maccabean revolt and the Hasmonean kings that come from it. The story of Hanukkah, that time, a couple centuries before Jesus. Before that time, it had been occupied by other nations, other peoples, and of course, in the distant past, had been occupied by Israelites. But for a long time, had been occupied by Phoenicians or Syrian-speaking peoples, etc. And then it was conquered, and there were a lot of kind of forcible converts, as far as I understand, to Judaism. So it seems to be kind of like a place that there's a lot more kind of ethnic tensions, or right. I mean, like divisions, and the kind of, can anything good come from Nazareth? Has something to do with maybe a Roman garrison, or I've heard some stories throughout the years about that there's a Roman presence there. There's a kind of foreign presence from the perspective of Jews. There's kind of a maybe mixed Jewish element, that is to say, Jews that are people who have converted to Judaism from other ethnicities or other faiths, and have kind of adopted Jewish ways, but are seen as kind of lesser by perhaps real Jews, people who called themselves, thought could draw their lineage back to Abraham or something. So all to say, do you think that plays in? Does that seem to that's kind of out there in the popular ways of understanding Jesus? But is that in the Gospels? Can we see that kind of like fraught suspicion or ethnic tension kind of between Jerusalem, Bethlehem, kind of the true Judahite areas, and this kind of Galilean, as you said, a backwater, but also maybe like a kind of I don't know, I'm thinking like the Star Wars cantina scene, these kind of like, Mos Eisley, it's a place of villainy and treachery. That's how some people depict Nazareth or Galilee. Is it like that actually? Or does it
my
seem
hunch
like
is not, and I don't know for sure, but my hunch would be not, and partly because I think the idea that Judah itself was some sort of pure, untainted place seems to me completely implausible, certainly by the New Testament period, if it ever was, right? Now, certainly they might have talked about their neighbors as the ones who were really, not as good as us. Like anytime you have a state rivalry, right? We talk about Alabama that way, but they talk about Georgia in the same way, right? So, yeah, I can imagine that the rhetoric is out there, but I'm not sure that that the reality looked any different on the ground to people.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add to this conversation, or this portion of the conversation. Maybe not even the conversation at all. But I did want to, before we sort of move on, Brennan, I think you helpfully ask us to consider the name Mary, and Yaroslav Pelikan, in his book on Mary, his first chapter is called Miriam in the New Testament. And so remind us of, Mary is sort of related to this word Miriam. Who's Miriam, and why might us keeping that in mind be important as we read about Mary in the New Testament?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, in Exodus, we hear the name of Miriam, and she is described as Moses' sister. There's also a narrative of Moses' sister in Exodus chapter 1 and 2 that we kind of see a bit of Moses' family, that story of the basket and the river. But the problem there is that Moses' sister is not named as Miriam in that chapter, in chapter 1 of Exodus. So, perhaps, of course, exegetes link these things, but it's possible Moses had more than one sister and so on. But also that Moses and Miriam and Aaron, Moses' brother, have this kind of conflicted, fraught relationship. That is that Miriam celebrates with Moses at the sea crossing, and she's described as a prophet. This is part of a tradition of women prophets in Israel that has been kind of obscured by both history and by culture and theology over time. But like Deborah, like Huldah, there was a strong tradition of women who were prophets in ancient Israel. Isaiah's wife is described as a prophet, not a wife of a prophet, but an actual prophet, even though she's anonymous in the text. So there's been an obscuring of these of the power and kind of generativity of these women prophets in Israelite history over time. But Miriam is this famous, important prophet. She also rebels against Moses in the book of Numbers and is punished for it along with Aaron. But just like Aaron's rehabilitated, I mean, Miriam, is not seen as a negative character in Israelite history, and becomes, an important name as far as I understand, right? In first century or BCE. Judah and Galilee, within the Jewish community, Miriam becomes one of the most powerful, popular names for women in that period. So in Hebrew, we're actually not sure what it means. A lot of Levite names are Egyptian names. So like Phineas and Hophni and so on, those are actually Egyptian names. So in Egypt, Mar would mean loved, beloved one. So Miriam might mean beloved person or person of love, but in Hebrew it can mean bitter, kind of like Mara, which is what Naomi changes her name to mean bitter, so it might mean that, but also some people have kind of understood it to mean something to do with the sea, Yam, so like Mir Yam could be like a part of the sea, a drop of water in the sea or something like that. But also it's been understood as star of the sea. If you've ever heard of Mary being called the star of the sea, that's kind of a mixed up an attempted etymology by people who didn't speak Hebrew. But in any event, I think Jerome might have been one of the first to come up with that one. But in any event, all to say, but it might have something to do with water, but we're not really sure exactly. But all to say that to me, when I read the New Testament, I mean, this struck me like crazy when I read Mary in Luke, that Mary receives this word from the angel, and this begins with "do not fear," which is how oracles of salvation begin. So to me, it seems like Mary is being set up as not just an inheritor of the name of Miriam or of like the fact that she's important like Miriam was, but that she is in the family of she is a prophet in her own right. She receives this oracle from God. She knows something in the Gospel of Luke, but also that she is set up as someone who is, in the family of the one who is set to lead Israel. So Moses and Miriam's family, but Jesus and Mary. So all to say, that to me that kind of strikes a nerve for an Old Testament scholar like myself. I perk up when I hear that name. But I don't know how important that would have been to people at the time, because it was so popular a name too, though.
Yeah.
Well, it seems a great connection to make. It seems, and I think often with these things, some people would have gotten the connection and some people would not have, right? But especially because Jesus' name is Jesus, right? Which is Joshua in Hebrew. So Joshua isn't Miriam's child or Moses' child, but he's the one who inherits the job from Moses, right? And so the kind of next generation in a way seems an echo that's pretty loud, at least for people who know the story well, right? Which a lot of people would have in that context. And I do think that Mary, we aren't really accustomed to thinking of Mary as a prophet in Luke's version of the story, but that's exactly how people would have understood it in the time frame, because they were familiar with prophecy. It was something that happened frequently. Both men and women prophesied, so that wouldn't have struck them as odd. And we have both Elizabeth and Mary and Zechariah. We've got a whole lot of prophecy going on at the beginning of Luke, right? So they may also have connected that to the Old Testament prophets as well. And
she also looks a lot like Rebecca in Genesis, who receives an oracle from God about where the lineage is supposed to go, and acts, to preserve the lineage of blessing. So in any event, to me, when I saw that, I thought, just kind of like Rebecca receives an oracle from God, and then has to do something to preserve it. So anyway, yeah.
And I just want to I think we have a question on this, but I don't know if we need to come back to it or not. But just to make clear for those that are watching that Matthew and Luke, one of the ways that they are very different in how they tell the story is that Luke tells the story primarily from the perspective of Mary. She's given a speaking role. She is given this vision. She, is moving about in the country to go see Elizabeth. Whereas when you open the Gospel of Matthew, the angel of the Lord appears to Joseph, and Joseph is the speaker. And Mary is sort of acted upon in the Gospel of Matthew. She doesn't really have the same sort of agency, to use a word that may or may not be helpful, that we see in Luke. And so just to Susan, to your earlier point about slowing down and reading the two infancy stories, we can see some of these differences. And just to say that the prominent place of Mary in the Gospel of Luke somewhat fits what we know about Luke's rhetorical and theological agenda, which includes more prominent place of women in places in the gospel, or certainly a subversive, the high being brought down low and the low being made high in terms of the gospel narrative. And so it's good just to sort of note that. And I don't know if you want to say anything more about how the prominent place of Mary in Luke's gospel, what that tells us about Luke's purposes or approach to telling the story of Jesus.
That's a really great question. I don't know that it can tell us much, but it is significant because Luke has a lot more women characters. They get a lot more airtime, and Matthew really doesn't. It's sort of like women don't really exist very much. I mean, there are a few, and they certainly play a prominent role at the tomb and things like that. But they just sort of disappear in a lot of the stories. And the opening is certainly an example of that. So in Luke, though, it seems less surprising, just as the gospel goes on, that the women at the opening of the story would also have had a prominent role and or that Luke might start to think of it from that perspective, like in telling the birth story, who is it a story about, right? And for him, it's a story about Mary, whereas for Matthew, it's clearly a story about Joseph, who hears God's message and follows what God tells him to do, and that's kind of what Matthew wants people to do. So it makes sense.
Yeah, that's helpful. So I think one of the places, that I can imagine people have questions about, or that we may have like a modern understanding of something that may not quite be the same on the ground, is this whole idea of being engaged, right? Both Matthew and Luke inform us that Mary and Joseph had some sort of betrothal, or they were engaged. But I wonder, from either of you, if we know, what that means, and how that might, be different from our modern conception of engagements that sometimes last, years at a time, or sometimes only last for a weekend before, people go run off and get married. So how can we understand engagement or betrothal as it might have been in the first century, and why that might be relevant for the Christmas story?
Yeah. I think also in antiquity, at least in this period, the range of periods of time for which people were engaged would have varied a lot. So, but maybe one of the biggest differences is that engagement then was really forming an alliance between families, and creating or cementing relationships that were there, so that families would then, help each other out. They might be business partners and have other kinds of relationships besides the marital relationships, but that engaging your children to one another, was a way of extending and forming those important relationships. So it's less about just the couple themselves, right, and their own interests and desires, for sure. So there, and I guess the other thing to say is that for a woman to get pregnant when she's engaged would not have been as big of a problem for them as it is for us, right? Christians today tend to stress like not having sex before you're married and things like this. So everybody's familiar with that way of thinking about it. And that's not really the issue. Like if it had been Joseph's child, nobody really would have cared that much, right? Because they're engaged. It's practically like being married. It's just that they're not, they don't live together yet, right? Which may just be the age of the girl, or, some other aspect of the finances of the family or something like that, right? So the problem is that it's not Joseph's child, right? So in this case, then it becomes a situation more like adultery, to think about what do you do? And people took adultery really seriously, and men were supposed to divorce their wives if they were adulterous and things like that. So the idea that Joseph would dismiss her would have made sense a lot in the context.
Yeah, that's helpful. Because, just even the pregnancy before marriage thing is so illuminating, because again, because of the ways in which many of us have been formed culturally to think about like this very strict, like something happens as soon as you say I do, that opens up the floodgates that you shouldn't be engaged in before. But that if this was Joseph's child, there wouldn't be legal ramifications or even maybe cultural issues. But also when you talk about the families being joined together, I think it really highlights the role of shame that would be, if this is in fact not Joseph's son, and that, this is a binding legal agreement between two families that potentially renders that agreement null, and then would cast all sorts of financial and cultural ramifications on Mary's family and probably Joseph's family. And again, it just helps me realize how different that is from my own understanding of the world.
Yeah, not that they practiced this at the time, but in the law of Moses, it says that if two young people have sex and they're not married and they're not, promised to someone else, the result is that they're supposed to get married. I mean, if you're already getting married, then like that's presumably not a problem. And there's no sort of law against sex before marriage in the law of Moses. I mean, it's kind of all shaped around the idea that it's in the spirit of trying to make sure that you form a family, and that at least the idea is that women aren't to be used as objects and cast aside and so on, because there is this, using ancient kind of science and medicine and so on, if women are going to become pregnant, and in that cultural day and age, I mean, if a man abandons this woman and then she is pregnant, that would have been pretty devastating to her life and her potential, so in any event, all to say, like, I mean, it seems kind of the idea is, make sure that you get married if you're going to try to get people pregnant. So, but it is that is such a different way of thinking about it. But also, I mean, there is a kind of a tinge to me, it seems, of suspicion about Jesus's parentage throughout the Gospels. I mean, people are wondering about this, and is this so there's that little kind of I don't know, wonder about who might Jesus's dad really be, if you don't believe that it's God. So. But there's also one other thing that we might kind of think about in terms of Mary and Jesus's birth and so on. So I mean, there's a long tradition that Joseph is a carpenter, and isn't this a carpenter's son and so on. That word in Greek is teknon, which means kind of like laborer, like manual laborer, more so than like a carpenter in particular, although the person probably would have done some work with wood. But all to say, so we have someone who might be a manual laborer and living in Galilee and so on. Is there anything we can deduce about like what this family's life would have been like? Or I'm guessing that women in different social strata would have had different opportunities, responsibilities, legal ramifications for their lives and so on. Is there anything we can kind of guess about who Mary was, what her life would have been like as a young Jewish woman growing up in or living at some point in Galilee with a teknon, as a husband?
Yeah. Do you remember where that teknon comes? Which gospel that's in?
Well, Mark says, right? Isn't this the teknon?
Yeah. So that's interesting, just because Mark says hardly anything about Jesus' family, right?
Right.
But
it's in Matthew 13:55 and Mark 6:3, where Jesus is identified as the son of a builder, carpenter,
that's right. And it's that sort of, isn't this Jesus, and we know his parents and what they do, kind of an idea, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so they seem to be offended by what Jesus is saying or doing based on, we know where he's from, sort of
social class and status and location or something.
Yeah. Yeah. Whereas Luke's gospel, I think, sort of sets us up to think of Jesus' family as more higher class than that, because Elizabeth is Mary's cousin and she's married to a priest,
right?
Which suggests that they're that, of a priestly class, right? So not everybody in the family is always the same social class, right? So I think it makes it really hard to say. But carpentry also varies a lot, right? And there's a lot of building going on in the Galilee during the period that we're talking about. And from Nazareth, you could get to some really big jobs too. So I think it makes it hard to say what level they were accustomed to living at.
I like that, Susan, because I think, again, true to a lot of your research, you're inviting us to see nuance and complexity in the text that we just don't know with this word if it means, oh, well, they're certainly of the lowest class, lowest of the low class, because there were plenty of people who held, manual labor sort of jobs that might have acquired a sort of prominence in the culture, were living relatively well in comparison to other people. And so it at least makes us ask the question, and what would be at stake if this does suggest lower economic status or higher economic status, and maybe at the end of the day we just have to say we don't know, because a word like this could mean maybe it doesn't mean that he's of the ruling class and he's driving in the equivalent of a Bentley in the first century. Maybe we are clear on that, but beyond that there's maybe some ground for wondering. So I'm looking at the time. We're at 10:11. I know we haven't gotten to all of our questions about the birth. Maybe just one sort of briefly, Susan, if you can talk about the fact that Jesus's birth by the agency of a divine being is not a unique story in the ancient world, particularly for people of prominent name recognition like Hercules or Heracles maybe. And so do you take any stake, or do you think that there's any sort of attempt on Matthew or Luke's part to sort of enter into that cultural conversation that Jesus's birth is miraculous, and that therefore he's like some of these other great people? Or is that maybe not the right question to be asking?
I mean, I think I guess the way I would put it is that people in the culture who were familiar with those stories would have understood it in similar terms, right? So whether or not Luke intended that, other people would have seen it that way, right? So the gods coming down and having sex with mortals, often was portrayed in Greek or Roman culture as a much more, physical engagement, right? Than what we see Luke doing. So I think there's a distinction perhaps, but the fact that it's a divine birth, and that the parentage in some way is divine and not human, would have struck people as familiar to other kinds of stories they knew.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we can just plant that as a seed in some people's heads for later investigation. So I want to talk about Mary, or the mother of Jesus, in the later ministry of Jesus. Again, this is probably a part of the Gospels that we don't often associate with Mary. She's so prominent in the infancy stories. But, the name Mary actually seems to almost drop out until the end of the stories, or till the end of the Gospels. But there is one really interesting story in the Gospel of John, which you've done a lot of research on the Gospel of John. And it's Jesus's first sign at the wedding of Canaan. And his mother isn't named, but we can assume that it's Mary, I think, with some degree of confidence. And what do we learn about Mary and Jesus in this, in this story and its significance in the Gospel of John?
It's a great story. One of my favorites. And I mean, part of the way it has troubled people for so many years is just this weird interaction between Jesus and his mother, right? So they're all invited to this wedding and they run out of wine, and she says to Jesus, they have no wine. And it's like she knows, come on, you got a job here. Like, but nothing's happened prior to this moment, right? In the Gospel of John, there's been no miraculous birth story. So we don't have the sense of like, what does Mary know? But she knows something, right? And so that's important, the way John tells the story, like people who perceive that Jesus is who he is, right? They, that's what John wants you to do, right? So she says they have no wine. He says, my hour is not yet come, right? Which is a reference to Jesus, not just death, but arrest and death and crucifixion and resurrection. And so somehow connects that end of the story with this beginning of the story. But Mary completely ignores him, right? Turns to the servants there and says, do whatever he tells you. As if he knows, like, I mean, she's his mom, right? So like, she's sort of pulling rank in a way. And Jesus does what she wants him to do, which is to provide wine for the feast. It's a great story.
Yeah. So in a way, it shows us some of the kind of, I don't know, realistic kind of fabric of Jesus's relationship to his mother. That there's some actual kind of mother-son dynamics happening here, which is interesting given the reputation of John's gospel for kind of putting Jesus above the clouds. That is, that Jesus in John's gospel is like not human, or this is one of those moments in John's gospel, like when Jesus breaks down and cries, that at Lazarus' tomb, that kind of subverts in some way the expectations one might have of John's gospel.
Yeah, I think it's important to pay attention to those when they happen too.
And it also, I think, I love how you pointed out, like, Mary must know that Jesus has these, even though the narrative hasn't told us, she must, and to me that's this gap that a later early Christian text, like the infancy gospel of Thomas, fills in with all sorts of creative and interesting insight, where Jesus is, killing his friend and, creating a bird out of a clay bird and, all of this. But that just, again, this place where early Christian reflection on Jesus and his story is tied to this gospel of, well, Mary must have known that Jesus could do some pretty miraculous stuff. Maybe he did it at, the wedding last weekend, and Mary's like, come on, Jesus, people are waiting. But it's just, I just love it. It's such a fascinating story in John 2. I think the other place, again, for the sake of time, that we might talk about Mary in the New Testament, in the Gospels, is at the end of his story, in the crucifixion narratives. And John is the only, as far as I recall, is the only gospel that clearly attaches Mary, or Jesus's mother, to the foot of the cross. The other Matthew, the other gospels name some Marys that are there, and we can infer that one of those Marys is Jesus's mother. But it's the Gospel of John that most clearly has Jesus's mother at the foot of the cross, with some other women. Again, what an important part of the narrative, that Mary is one of the witnesses to the crucifixion, possibly to the burial of Jesus. And again, what insight do we have from these texts that say Mary is there for this really horrible and important event? Yeah, it is. And it's interesting in John that, like, she shows up in chapter 2 in that initial story, and then there's nothing until chapter 19, where she shows up at the foot of the cross with Mary Magdalene and the beloved disciple, right? I think, partly in John's gospel, to me at least, it suggests that perhaps Mary has really been there all along, and we just haven't, she just hasn't been brought to our attention. But she's certainly, everybody else in John's gospel, and the other gospels too, like all the male disciples flee, right? They're out of there once this goes down, but not the women, right? And in this case, Mary is there, and actually the beloved disciple, so probably one male disciple, oddly, in John, is there at the foot of the cross as a witness to what happens. So so we have that sense of her perseverance, I guess. But then there's this weird interaction too, right? So they're standing there, and Jesus says, woman, behold your son, referring to the beloved disciple, and behold your mother.
to him. And so what's that? It's just like a lot of John. It's highly metaphorical, fraught language, but it's also really hard to figure out what the heck it means. Usually people see it as a sort of formation of a spiritual family, right, or a church family kind of thing, that is taking place here in the moment of Jesus' crucifixion. So it certainly has a lot of deep meaning, but it's also just this very brief, kind of suggestive moment.
Yeah. Well, and I think we'll find out more in week 2 and 4 of our study, but I think that scene from John is one of the places that suggests the sort of Christian veneration of Mary, because again, if we take the beloved disciple not just as a character in the Gospel of John, but as sort of the ideal Christian, everybody could be the beloved disciple, then John seems to be saying that Mary is the mother of all Christian disciples, and that sort of spins into some of this later veneration of Mary that we see.
Right. And Mary becoming a sort of symbol for the church as a whole.
Right.
And in just thinking about that Mary's faithfulness is then underscored in the ending of the Gospel of John, that she is there when almost everyone else is abandoned, but also that she's kind of willing to take in the sight of Jesus's death. And I note that in Luke, it's unclear which Marys exactly are at the cross, but in the beginning of in Luke 1, I mean, Mary hears from the angel that a sword will pierce her heart. Is that perhaps referencing to this idea that Mary is going to have to live past and live with the knowledge of her son's execution? Is this what you think? So in other words, across several Gospels, Mary's pain, the pain that comes with not just bearing Jesus, but also of his life, seems to be kind of shared between John and the Synoptic Gospels in some way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, Luke is really the only one that makes that very explicit in that one sort of prophetic statement. And we don't know where Mary is at the end of the story in Luke, but she does show up again at the beginning of Acts, right? So when Luke starts to tell the next part of the story, there's Mary again at the beginning, when the disciples are gathered and praying after Jesus' death and before Pentecost.
And what can I just, before we move away from the Gospels, there is that one thing that suggests some of this tension that we see. So there's a story of the wedding at Canaan, which has a bit of that tension between Mary and Jesus, but ultimately Jesus kind of, in a way, gives in to his mom. But in the Synoptic Gospels, there's this story that occurs several times where there's some conflict, it seems, between Jesus and his family, including his mom. So what can we learn from this story about perhaps the family being embarrassed or upset or somehow feeling threatened by what Jesus is doing and then the attention he's receiving?
Yeah, I mean, Mark's version of that is the sharpest one, and I think it mostly makes sense because Mark doesn't have a birth narrative, and we don't know that much about the family, right? But in chapter 3, they come to get Jesus, right? They're saying he has gone out of his mind, and it's part of a passage in my mind that's sort of saying, look, either the people are wondering, is Jesus possessed by demons, or does he actually have power to cast out demons, right? And that's a live question. Like, he's got some kind of crazy power, but we're not sure what it is. It's really unusual, right? And the family seems to be on the side of, like, he must be possessed by a demon. We've got to take some action here because this is not going to go well.
Yeah. And I think that this is a place, even, Susan, where we see some of the differences and dissonance among the Gospels. Mark, I think, presents it in the most harshest way, and maybe Matthew and Luke smooth it out a little bit. And I think the only other thing, Brennan, that I would say to your question is, in some ways it mirrors the reality of Christians who experienced alienation and separation from their families as a result of, because it becomes this statement, who's my father, who's my mother? Well, anybody who does the will of God is now this sort of pseudo family. And so, Jesus's own experience, at least in some parts of the gospel, sort of mirror that. But that's where the dissonance comes in, because then Mary shows up at the end of the Gospel of John and probably in the end of the Synoptics, so that whatever that tension was, it resolved itself by the end of his life. And one could think that Mary was trying to save Jesus at that early stage from, what was going to happen if you keep talking this way. You're gonna run into some trouble, Jesus.
Yeah.
And even in Luke, it's not totally smooth, like Mary's level of understanding. She has these amazing moments at the beginning where she's, prophesying and accepting God's will and to be part of that. But then when Jesus is at the temple, he's teaching there, right? And the family leaves and goes home, and they don't know that he's not with them, right? And they go back, and he's like, "Didn't you know I would be in my Father's house?" But it says they don't understand. So the parents and both of them are clearly confused by the whole, which makes you wonder, like, why wouldn't they know? But on the other hand, like, how could anybody really understand in the moment any of that going on, whether it's the disciples or Jesus' family? It just seems like it's all a little bit beyond human comprehension.
Yeah, especially if we consider like the full humanity of Jesus and what gets worked out hundreds of years later in Chalcedonian definition. All right, so for our final question, surprising places where you might find Mary in the New Testament, trivia game. We don't see mention of Mary in the letters of Paul. There's a mention of Jesus born of a woman, but seeming just to suggest that he was human, not something else. But some interpreters of the New Testament would have us look at Revelation 12, which for those watching and following along that may not have read Revelation recently, which is what probably 90% of the people watching, this is the very strange story about a woman who gets pregnant and who at the time of her birth is trying to get away from this dragon figure who is really after eating the child that she's about to bear. And so it's super strange. But some interpreters have said, well, this is the story of Jesus's birth, or maybe this is the birth of the church. But, in our closing minutes, do you have anything to weigh in about the presence or absence of Mary in Revelation 12 in this admittedly strange story?
It is a really strange story. I mean, Revelation is a strange, whatever it is. But it's not surprising that people have seen Mary in this story, I guess, is what I'll say, right? She's a woman who's about to bear a child, and that the child and she are under some sort of threat, right? So it kind of sounds like, and then it's not only that, but she's going to give birth to a son, a male child, who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron, right? And so that that language about Christ ruling comes up other places in Revelation, right? So it sounds a lot like Mary in that sense, but then other parts of it don't really sound like Mary too. So as people interpret it, this is, I think, another one of the places where Mary sort of morphs into the church as the story goes along. Like initially, she's just a woman bearing a child who has some threat to him. But then in the latter part of it, it says, the child was snatched away and taken to God and to his throne. But the woman fled into the wilderness where she's nourished by God. So how would that be Mary in the story, right? It doesn't actually track very neatly onto the gospel story of Mary. But then the idea that after Jesus' ascension, right, the church becomes this, where the location of the threat, right, and in need of nourishment and sustenance by God. And so there's that sort of move. That's certainly not the only way to understand the language in Revelation, but it makes sense that people have seen it that
way. And modern interpreters of Revelation often want John to be more clear or consistent than he is. I mean, it wouldn't be at all beyond John's rhetorical or theological agenda to sort of blend these two images so that, the story of Jesus, and Mary, his mother, at the beginning sort of morphs into this story of the church by the end. That's not at all
Yeah.
beyond the realm of possibilities for anybody that's read Revelation carefully, and
right.
how the symbolism and the language sort of plays on itself.
Yeah, one thing you can say about it too is that how evocative this language is and how productive and generative it's been throughout Christian history. I mean, the Virgin of Guadalupe, right? I mean, this fantastically interesting and influential, important image, right? That goes back to the Nahuatl, the Mesoamerican inhabitants of Mexico, that became, the national symbol of Mexico, and has been involved in freedom, like liberation movements throughout the, early modern and modern period. And it's this image of Mary as the woman clothed with the sun. So to say that this is even if it didn't mean that in John's mind or something, that it has had an influential kind of life of its own after that fact.
Yeah, it's kind of the Mary reigns supreme kind of an image that we are left with.
Yeah, that's great. All right, well, we're just at time. It's 10:30, which we could continue. I mean, there's places we could circle back and go much deeper. But Susan, thank you. You've helped us, I think, really lay out the story of Mary in the New Testament and some of the complexities and nuances of that portrait that we'll then see get taken up in subsequent interpretation. So again, thank you for illuminating us and our participants. Brennan, next week, we're going to continue with this conversation about Mary with Mary and early Christianity. And by that, we sort of mean post-New Testament, early Christian reflection on Mary. And we'll be joined by Dr. Brittany Wilson, who teaches New Testament at Duke Divinity School. A Princeton graduate for her PhD, not a Emory grad, but at least she has that connection with our list of names.
Also, someone that I have eaten asparagus with in an ancient fortress. So. And
how many people can you say that about?
Very few.
Not very many. Thanks for having me, you guys. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you
thanks so much.
That
was great.
Thanks everyone for joining us. We'll see you next week.